Tonight. Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name's Deborah Palmer, and I'm facilitating tonight's session on behalf of Mosman Council. I'd now like to hand over to Madam Mayor, who's going to provide us with an acknowledgement of country. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I would like to acknowledge the Borragagal and Camaragal people as the traditional custodians on the land on which we work, live and gather this evening. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and honour their enduring connection to country. Let us learn from their knowledge and continue to walk together in the spirit of reconciliation and respect for all First Nations people. Thanks, Deborah.
Thank you so much. And thank you again to everybody who's joined us this evening. So the focus of tonight's session is to provide you with an overview of the New South Wales Government's recently implemented low and medium rise housing policy and to answer as many questions as we can in the session that you might have in relation to that policy. So really to help you to understand the changes that have happened and what it means for Mosman as well. So we're going to outline for you tonight in a few moments in a presentation about what those sort of key changes have been. And then we're going to actually work through a number of different questions which were submitted ahead of tonight's session. So when we asked you to register for tonight's session, we asked also for people to submit some questions and we'll work through those questions. And we'll also have an opportunity to answer any other questions that you might have in tonight's session as well. So this is just one way that Council has been speaking to the community. There was an in-person session held last Wednesday evening, and that was at a capacity audience as well. So really good to see that there's so much interest in the community too. And there is also an opportunity following tonight's session to book a meeting with one of the council advisors at council to talk through any details that might actually relate to your property specifically as well. Before we get into the detail, I just want to let you know that we are recording tonight's session and a copy of the recording will be made available on the Mosman Council website following tonight's session as well. So to ensure everybody's privacy, we've just made sure that everybody's cameras are turned off apart from myself and the panel members as well. I'll run through how to ask questions in just a moment, but before I do that, I'd like to introduce you to the panel. So you've met the Mayor, Anne-Marie Kimber, the General Manager, Dominic Johnson, if you want to say hi, Dominic, and also to the Team Coordinator of Urban Planning, Sarah Wallace, is joining us tonight in the panel. It's great to have the three of you with us this evening, and thank you for making the time available. So in terms of just some housekeeping as well, if you're having any difficulties with connecting into the session tonight or the audio, whatever it might be, if you'd like to give the number on the screen a call there, somebody within Mosman Council should be able to give you an assistance with any technical difficulties that we might have as well. And I've mentioned too that the session will be recorded tonight and put on the council's website. And we are actually going to produce a frequently asked questions document which will go onto Council's website as well. So that will capture what we've discussed in the session, but if there's any outstanding questions that we aren't able to get to in tonight's session at all. If you would like to ask a question throughout the session, if you'd like to use the Q&A function, so you'll see that at the top of your screen, there's two speech bubbles there with Q&A. If you pop those in there, I'll be able to read those and I'll be able to try and get through as many questions as I can. I might not read out your precise question, but what I'll try and do is consolidate some of the key questions that we're hearing coming through as well. And just to let you know too, we won't be able to address any specific questions about your specific property in tonight's session, and we really encourage you to reach out to Council and, as I said before, to book that one-on-one session with the Development Officer at Council to help you with that as well. So now I'd like to hand back to the Mayor to provide a bit of context and introduction to the session. Thank you.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Deborah, and welcome again, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Tonight, we'll be providing you with the same presentation that we delivered last week to a capacity audience at the Allan Border Oval Pavilion. Apologies if we were unable to accommodate you at that in-person session, but that's why we have this evening so everyone could join in their own convenience. The level of participation at both that session and again here tonight shows that so many of you are very interested in this particular topic and these state government planning changes and what it means for Mosman. It's a rapidly evolving situation. The new low and mid-rise housing policy was announced by the government only days before it came into effect. And just over a week ago, the Department of Planning, Housing and Infrastructure released its proposed streamlined assessment pathways for low-rise designs in the New South Wales Housing Pattern Book, giving little more than a fortnight for feedback. As a council, we are also navigating what it means for the work that we do and for the community that we serve. And while we don't have all the answers, tonight is an opportunity for us to share what we do know so far about something that we didn't invite and nonetheless have to respond to. We want to share what we know, and that's why we're hosting these community information sessions to keep you informed. These new controls will override council's planning controls and allow higher and denser development than is currently permitted. While we can't be definitive, council staff are working hard to understand and share just how these changes will apply in Mosman. Given these changes have been thrust upon us, and we are still working through the implications, this session may not provide all the answers that you're looking for. But this is an ongoing engagement. As more details are released by the state government, we will be working hard to share these with you as quickly as we can. This session tonight is not about agitating, but informing, explaining what we do know so far and how this applies to Mosman. It's a journey. The introduction of these planning changes will continue to be important for the community for months and years to come. And this is just the beginning. I'll now hand over to our General Manager, Dominic Johnson, who will go through a bit more of the information about this policy.
Thank you very much, Madam Mayor. Sarah, do you mind just advancing the slide? Or James, thank you. So look, this is the agenda for this evening. I'll provide a little bit of a broader context about the planning changes. You'll hear more detail from Sarah Wallace, specifically around how the low and mid-rise will take effect in Mosman and our next steps in terms of both dealing with the changes, but also there'll be a discussion about how we agitate to perhaps amend some of the changes to favour the community. There'll be a broad question and answer session and then a closing from the Mayor. So we might just start with the Housing Accord, which was introduced in 2022. And I think that's a good place to start because it would serve us all well to remember that there has been a housing crisis in Sydney for some time. Some people would argue there's been a housing crisis for a decade or two. And what we've really found in the last few years, it's become very much a matter of conversation. And with the imminent federal election, it's certainly front of mind for a lot of people. I think the combined impact of COVID, supply issues, and the increase in rent, as well as the increase in housing price, have all been contributors. And there's a lot of conversation in the community about other factors such as immigration and the like. But nonetheless, in 2022, the Prime Minister met with all of the individual state premiers and came up with a housing accord. That set a target for each of those states, and here in New South Wales, we got a pretty ambitious target of 377,000 new dwellings. And that, if achieved, would be much greater than the typical dwelling numbers that we've been seeing over the last few years. The housing target as it boiled down for Mosman was 500. And some people might opine that's a pretty low number, but it's important to remember Mosman Council is the smallest local government area in Sydney except for Hunters Hill. So it's the second smallest out of those 22 council areas. Plus, it's a pretty dense suburb already. So those of you who live here in Mosman would know there's a lot of apartments and about 2/3 of our residents live in an apartment. So that housing target, which is still a target we have to achieve, is only 500. We think we'll comfortably achieve that, and in part that's because of these housing reforms. Traditionally, the way planning was done here at Mosman, like every other council, was the planning controls that were in play at the time were reviewed by the council staff. there was a discussion with the councillors and then consultation with the community to see whether those planning controls should be amended. But as you heard from the Mayor, unusually in this instance, the Planning Minister has brought in a sweeping reform that actually negates all of those individual plans, all of those individual local environmental plans for each council, and overrides them, at least in terms of density and development in some of the low and mid-rise areas. I wouldn't want you to think this is a new thing that the government's just come out with in the last few months. They've actually been working away at this approach for several years. In 2023, the first tranche of this process began with the infill affordable housing that provides bonuses for developers when they wish to build housing if some of that housing is affordable. Then in July 2024, the stage 1 of the low and mid-rise housing, which really made dual occupancy widely available in the residential areas, was introduced. That's in July 2024. Then transit-orientated development, that change in policy construct came in late 2024. That doesn't apply here in Mosman. It's specifically around train stations, and some of you may have read in the paper or heard on the news some of the concerns that's elicited itself. It is much denser than anything we're likely to experience here, and in some instances does include 20, 30 or even taller residential flat buildings. But as I say, that does not impact us here in Mosman. It's stage 2 for the low and mid-rise housing policy that is really the matter for discussion tonight. And that was made law in February, on the 28th of February 2025, that came into play. And that has been captured in a state environmental planning policy. If you just want to go to the next slide, please, James. Which was amended, and as I say, it took effect on 28th of February. So it's in law now. This is not a conceptual conversation we're having tonight. This is something that's currently in play, and people can put development applications in right now, taking advantage of these changes. So the intention here is to provide a range of low and mid-rise housing solutions that are located in the right places. I think there was 122 different localities where this will take effect. And of course, there'll be a lot of discussion about whether that's something the state government should have done, needed to have done, has done in the right respect. Certainly, as the Mayor suggested, it's not something we're expecting. We, as a council, and I know many other councils, lobbied very hard to be allowed to make the planning reforms themselves, to be given targets and to allow those targets to be achieved. Nonetheless, the Premier and the Minister for Planning have decided to do this themselves and override Council's long standing processes and controls. The policy is expected to deliver 112,000 homes across New South Wales. The majority of those will be in Sydney. And it sits within the SEP, or the State Environmental Planning Policy for Housing, in Chapter 6. It's a new chapter that's been created. So that gives you a little bit of context. I just would like to add that Mosman Council's always worked very hard with successive governments, be they left or right, to deliver housing. It's not always been able to meet its targets, but that's in part because of the fact we don't actually build the homes ourselves. High property prices and a number of other factors have been in play. But in this instance, there's certainly a conviction amongst the councillors that this is an unfortunate outcome and something they're looking to work with the Planning Minister to rectify in the months to come. But at this stage, I might hand over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Dominic. So I'm going to have a look at what the low and mid-rise changes mean for Mosman. There'll be new forms of development permissible within the R2 low density residential zone, including dual occupancies, terraces, townhouses, and 2-storey residential flat buildings. New controls apply to land zoned R2 low density residential and R3 medium density residential within 800 metres walking distance of nominated town centres. New controls override council's local environmental plan and development control plan planning controls and allow higher and denser development than is currently permitted. Land within 800 metres walking distance of nominated town centres is known as the housing area. Within the housing area, there is the inner housing area, which is land within 400 metres walking distance of a town centre, and the outer housing area, which is land within 400 to 800 metres walking distance of a town centre. We'll now take a look at the various town centres affecting Mosman. Firstly, we have the Spit Junction Town Centre. This is the only designated town centre located within the Mosman local government area. What you're looking at on your screen is an extract of the town centres map, which is a statutory map under State Environmental Planning Policy housing. You are able to view this on the New South Wales Planning Portal Spatial Viewer. So this map shows an outline of what the town centre is. It is important to note that land within the Spit Junction Town Centre is zoned E1 and is not subject to the reforms. The LEP and DCP controls will continue to apply to the Spit Junction Town Centre. These typically have a 15-metre maximum height requirement and a floor space ratio of 2.5 to 1, which typically allows for 4 to 5 storey buildings. Next, we're looking at the Cremorne Town Centre. So this once again is an extract of the town centre's map that shows the boundary of the town centre. The state government has released an indicative map showing the housing areas shaded, that is, land within 800 metres of the town centres. Developed using walking distance software, the map includes a disclaimer that it is a guide only and should not be used to inform planning decisions. The map does not factor in individual property constraints and local walking networks. Land is shaded even though the policy does not apply to that land. For example, heritage items are shaded. Next, we will have a bit more of a detailed look at what walking distance means. We have received many questions from you around how to calculate walking distance and whether a site is in or out of the 400 and 800 metre housing areas. The State Environmental Planning Policy includes a definition of walking distance, which is the shortest distance between 2 points measured along a route that may be safely walked by a pedestrian using, as far as reasonably practicable, public footpaths and pedestrian crossings. The key phrase within the walking distance definition is safely walked. For busy roads such as Spit Road, the walking distance must be shown crossing at traffic lights or a designated crossing and must follow the road rules. Walking distance is measured from the nearest edge of the map town centre, which is the blue line on the map on your screen, along a publicly accessible walking route. The applicant will need to demonstrate how their land meets the walking distance requirement as part of their development application. As part of the DA assessment, Council will look at proposed walking distance routes very closely and will be guided by emerging case law in terms of what is appropriate. For some sites, particularly those near the edge of the 400 or 800 metres, it may be necessary for a surveyor to precisely calculate walking distances. We'll now take a look at the LMR application in Mosman. James, change the slide. FEP housing identifies various land exclusions. Relevant to Mosman, land exclusions include heritage items, bushfire-prone land, coastal wetlands, littoral rainforest, and the coastal vulnerability area. The reforms do not apply to employment zones or in the C4 environmental living zone. They do apply to heritage conservation areas. The reforms introduce a new type of planning control for Mosman, known as a non-discretionary development standard, also known as a non-refusal standard. These provide consistent development standards for matters like building height, floor space ratio, and lot size. They overrule a local environmental plan or development control plan standard, depending on what is the more permissive. If the proposed development complies with the non-discretionary development standard, the consent authority cannot refuse the application on the grounds of the standard. We'll now have a look at the new forms of development permissible under the reforms. Firstly, dual occupancies. Dual occupancies are two dwellings on one lot of land and can be either attached or detached. Stage 1 of the LMR reforms permitted dual occupancy statewide in the R2 zone. Stage 2 brought in non-refusal standards within the housing area in the R2 and R3 zones for dual occupancies. These are lot size, minimum 450 metres squared, lot width, minimum 12 metres, floor space ratio, maximum 0.65 to 1, height, maximum 9.5 metres, and car parking 1 space per dwelling. Council's LEP and DCP controls continue to apply outside the housing area. The next form of development is multi-dwelling housing terraces. These are 3 or more dwellings with where each dwelling has a frontage to a public road. The dwellings are located side by side with no part of a dwelling located above another. The reforms permit this form of development in the R2 zone for the first time within the housing area. New non-refusal standards within the housing area in both the R2 and R3 zone are lot size, 500 square metres, lot width, 18 metres, floor space ratio, 0.7 to 1, height, maximum 9.5 metres, and car parking, 0.5 spaces per dwelling. The next is multi-dwelling housing. This is 3 or more dwellings, whether attached or detached, on one lot of land, each with access at ground level, but does not include a residential flat building. This form of development is now permitted in the R2 zone for the first time within the housing area only. Non-refusal standards within the housing area applying to both the R2 and R3 zone are lot size minimum 600 square metres, lot width 12 metres, floor space ratio maximum 0.7 to 1, and a height of 9.5 metres, and car parking 1 space per dwelling. This table outlines the controls applying to residential flat buildings and shop top housing on land in zoned R2 and provides a comparison with council's controls. Council did not previously permit residential flat buildings in the R2 zone, but on the right-hand side, you can see the controls that now apply in the R2 zone. So we've got a minimum lot size of 500 square metres, a minimum frontage of 12 metres, a height of 9.5 metres, and a floor space ratio of 0.8 to 1. This table outlines the controls applying to residential flat buildings and shop top housing on land zoned R3 and provides a comparison with council's controls. Different standards apply depending on the distance from the town centre, and this is where the inner and outer housing areas come into play. Council previously allowed residential flat buildings in the R3 zone, so the permissibility has not changed. The height applying to residential flat buildings in the R3 zone under council's control in the past was 8.5 to 11 metres. In the inner housing area, that is within 0 to 400 metres of the town centre, developments are now able to have 6 stories or fewer, and for residential flat buildings, a height of 22 metres, and for shop top housing development, 24 metres. In the outer housing area, which is land within 400 to 800 metres from the town centre, it's 4 stories or fewer, or 17.5 metres. The floor space ratio in the inner housing area is now permitted at 2.2 to 1, in the outer housing area 1.5 to 1. Council's LEP controls have that at 0.6 to 1 to 1 to 1, based on the site's location. Infill affordable housing bonuses that were introduced in 2023 will apply to the low and mid-rise housing areas. This will allow up to 30% additional height and floor space ratio where the development includes affordable housing. How will the low and mid-rise housing policy applications be assessed and determined? Where council is the consent authority, DA documentation will be available on the application tracker for the public to view. DAs will be notified in accordance with the Mosman Community Participation Plan, and there will be opportunity to make a submission. Most DAs will be referred to the Mosman Local Planning Panel for determination. Applications will be assessed in accordance with the documents on your screen. So for residential flat buildings, that includes the State Government's Apartment Design Guide, the Tree Canopy Guide for low and mid-rise housing, and the Mosman Residential Development Control Plan. The LEP and DCP controls remain relevant where they are not otherwise addressed by the non-refusal standards, or for residential flat buildings, the Apartment Design Guide. Many of you on registration to attend tonight submitted questions that you would like us to answer. These questions have been grouped into 8 key themes, which I will now go through.
Sarah, sorry, just before you go through that, just wanted to also let people know that if you'd like to ask a question in the session, if you could please do that using the Q&A function. I do see that somebody's got their hand raised, but unfortunately we don't have that ability to go to individual questions. If you'd like to go to the Q&A, that would be a really great way for us to be able to understand your questions as we go forward. But Sarah, thank you. Back to you and the key questions that we heard in the session beforehand.
Thanks, Deborah. Will owners be notified if their site is within the 800-metre housing area? Mosman Council advocated for clear mapping showing which land is within the housing areas to provide certainty to the community. Unfortunately, the state government have indicated they will not be releasing mapping showing what properties are in and out. Owners will not be notified if their site is within the housing area. Owners will need to work this out for themselves or engage a professional town planner or architect to assist them to understand if a site is in the housing area. What is the impact of the new policy on view sharing and overshadowing? Can a developer now put up a 6-story building on our site and block the harbour views and solar access enjoyed by others? If a development is compliant, we can't guarantee there won't be significant impact on views and solar access. Each application will be assessed on a case-by-case basis. There may be some opportunity to look at if a more skillful design can lessen impacts on views and overshadowing. However, this may be limited. How quick is the approval process for development under the low and mid-rise? The state government requires council to determine applications at an average of 105 days. Some applications will be assessed quicker and some slower, depending on the complexities of each application. Noting it takes additional time when a DA is required to be referred to the panel. How will council protect heritage buildings within the LMR area? The final iteration of the LMR housing policy exempt heritage items from the reforms. Each application involving heritage will be considered on a case-by-case basis. The existing heritage provisions contained in the LEP and DCP will continue to be considered in the assessment of the application. Any developments adjoining heritage items or within heritage conservation areas must have a design that's sympathetic to heritage significance. What considerations have been made regarding expanding, managing local infrastructure with a proposed higher density living in the area? This was a major concern that Council raised in its submission to the LMR reforms. There has been no announcement of additional funding for local infrastructure. The state government has not released any modelling showing what the uptake may be in different local government areas. It remains unclear what the uptake will be in Mosman and what pressure this will place on infrastructure. In time, Council will need to review its contributions plan and capital works program, but we can't do this until we understand what the uptake of the reforms will be. How will building setbacks be established? The Apartment Design Guide and the Residential Development Control Plan both contain building separation standards that will be applied to the LMR development applications. If a property is in the LMR zone, but is also within a scenic protection area under the LEP, does this override or limit the LMR planning rules applicable to this property? Scenic protection under clause 6.4 of the Mosman Local Environmental Plan will continue to be a relevant matter for consideration. Have any LMR DAs been lodged in Mosman? No, they have not. Council was recently notified by the department that a discussion paper on the New South Wales Pattern Book Planning Pathways is on exhibition. The department is currently seeking feedback on 8 low-rise housing designs and streamlined pathways for these low-rise designs. This includes a complying development pathway and also a streamlined development assessment pathway. It's a very short exhibition period from the 31st of March until the 17th of April. Council staff are currently reviewing the discussion paper and will be preparing a submission, and there will be a report to the next council meeting. We'll now have a look at the next steps. As I just suggested, we're preparing a council report and submission regarding the pattern books and planning pathways. Our planning advisor has been inundated with inquiries regarding the low and mid-rise, and in response, we are moving to an online booking system for face-to-face meetings with the planning advisor. This is set up now, so if you have any questions following tonight's session, I invite you to book a time to speak with the planning advisor. In the closing, the Mayor will speak to the actions arising from the March Council meeting. I will now hand back to Deborah.
Thanks very much, Sarah. That was a terrific job, a lot to get through there. And thank you to Dominic and to Madam Mayor as well for the introduction and context there, which I think has been really important for people to understand. As Sarah mentioned earlier, people, when they were registering for tonight's session, were asked to provide questions, and we received over 60 questions actually heading into tonight's session as well. So I've also done some consolidation of some of those questions, and I'm going to run through some of those, and there's some other questions that are coming through the chat, the Q&A function as well. So we're going to try and get through as many questions as we can between now and 7:30, where we'll be looking to sort of close the session. So I'll try and get through as many questions as I can, keep them coming in the chat, in the Q&A. And just a reminder too that this session is being recorded, so both the recording and the pack that's being spoken to as well will be available as part of the recording on the council website if you wanted to follow up with any detailed information as well. So Sarah, I'm going to come to you with the question that's first off. Is it possible that the 800 metres will be extended or the LRM policy otherwise changed in the future?
At this point in time, what we have before us is legislated. So, but it is not to say that the state government couldn't change that in the future, but not in the short term.
Terrific, thank you. This is a question which I think might be a bit of a combination of both you, Dominic, and you, Madam Mayor. What plans has Mosman Council put together to address alternative options for housing developments in the Mosman LGA in line with Ku-ring-gai Council's proactive response to housing supply and density?
Yeah, look, that's a great question. I think, first of all, we need to understand that those of you who are aware of what Ku-ring-gai Council has done, which is essentially take the planning minister to court about their transport orientated development, is not a similar example of what's happened to Mosman and in fact every other council area in Sydney. So they had some very specific issues with their town centre and the huge density proposed around the train stations up there in Ku-ring-gai. And they found some reasons why they could challenge that in court, and a judge granted them standing to do just that, to challenge them in court. What they negotiated with the Department of Planning is to, instead of taking the density where the department wanted it or where the minister wanted it, was to put an alternate plan to them that would deliver the same amount of housing but protect some of their heritage areas. I wouldn't like anyone to think that was necessarily a playbook that anyone else could use. And the reason for that is, first of all, we don't have a TOD, as I've said, and this was quite unique to that experience and that particular planning pathway. And secondly, the appetite of the government to allow councils to, I guess, determine where additional infill or denser housing might appear. That appetite is not really there on a broad basis across the city. They certainly had heard from Mosman and many other councils they would like that opportunity, but nonetheless they've taken the action that they have. That is, they've brought in this SEP, which overrules everything. So we will attempt to meet with the planning minister and get some changes for our sake and for the community's sake, but I don't think they're going to be particularly receptive right now to that. They'd like to see a lot of housing be delivered quite quickly. And if they started making exceptions here in Mosman, they'd be making exceptions everywhere. We all like to think we're unique, but in reality, I think a lot of communities are going to be grappling with these changes. And I don't think the planning minister would make an exception for us more than anyone else. The final point I'd like to make is we have been planning for growth for a long time. The mayor and the councillors have been very clear they're happy to do their share. We do have an LEP and we do have reviews of that and a statement we released to the community about our strategic planning intent. That was guided by the Greater Cities Commission and it all seemed to be quite appropriate up until 2 or 3 years ago when the Greater Cities Commission was disbanded and that entire process abandoned. So we are, I guess, responding as best we can right now, but we don't have any alternate options or a way of forcing the minister to the table to understand what those alternate options are right at this time.
Terrific. Thanks, Dominic. And I'm going to come to you with another, I guess, follow-up question, which has come through in the Q&A from people as well, is are Mosman Council considering taking any legal action against the department in relation to the policy implementation around LMR?
Yeah, look, we've certainly explored whether there was something we could do. We've got advice from a KC or a King's Council that's about as senior as it gets. And that's quite detailed. We obtained that last year. And then the councillors and senior staff recently met with an eminent lawyer on this very matter. And the consensus from the legal side of things is very little you can do. A state environmental planning policy is a very broad brush and it is given to ministers to exercise as they see fit. In essence, it was explained to us, if you don't like this policy, you can't really legally challenge it. The best thing to do is vote it out. So that opportunity obviously will come when the next state election comes along. But some, as I say here tonight, will be happy that these changes have occurred, and some people will be very interested to see whether they can benefit from the uplift as a result of these changes. And there's definitely a need for new housing. No one's denying that. It's just a matter of whether this is the right way to do it and what it means for our community in the short term.
So I'm going to go to a question that I think sort of flows on from that quite nicely, which is really around property prices. So do the presenters believe that these new regulations will affect property prices in the 400 metre and 800 metre radius currently, or will this be more relevant once approvals and works start happening?
I'm happy to answer that unless
Yeah.
somebody else.
Well,
I reckon we'd all agree that property prices or land value will go up. And that's a natural function of once you can put more development on a piece of land, you can realise more profit from it, and that will flow on to the land value. It's disappointing to note that these changes don't have any value capture. So essentially, there are going to be winners and losers. Those people within the 800 metre area that are appropriately zoned. Some of them will be winners, and some of them may well be in conversation right now with developers or with their neighbours in terms of consolidating their lots and with the intention of putting a development application in, speaking to the low and mid-rise changes. So definitely I anticipate seeing property value in the 800 metre zone increase where it is appropriately zoned. I don't know if anybody else had anything to add. No, that was it, Deborah.
Great, thanks, Dominic. Then there's quite a few questions that are coming through around, or comments coming through around traffic and congestion and how the road network, local streets are going to be able to cope with this change. Any sort of comments in there around sort of increased traffic as a result of these changes?
Yeah, look, I think it's a good question, and we're very mindful that we were expecting to get a pretty big tunnel under Mosman called the Beaches Link, and that unfortunately got cancelled. So the opportunity to kind of deal with traffic is somewhat limited, and many people in Mosman would understand that there's not too many roads in and out of Mosman, and there's a modest ferry service and not many other alternatives. So as density increases, naturally traffic increases and traffic impacts become more profound. What we have is a number of intersections that really struggle during peak hour, and the tidal flows for us are very real. There's only so many things council itself can do to ameliorate that. We are fortunate to have a pretty good bus service, but that's not the panacea to everything. So look, the simple and disappointing answer to that question, Deborah, is traffic will probably get a bit worse, and obviously we'll be looking for public transport and active transport solutions to offset that. But you can expect to wait a little longer at the lights, and you can expect to work a little harder to find that empty car space when you've got another 5,000 or 10,000 people living here.
Thanks.
I could probably add to that
Yes.
as well, Deborah, in that along with these planning control changes that have come through, what we haven't seen is any infrastructure modelling, any guidance at all as to how this may impact communities, not just Mosman, but all suburbs. And so that is difficult because there's been no announcement of extra infrastructure funding either. And that will be a significant issue for all councils, including Mosman. So that is the disappointing part. It feels like it's come very quickly, even though they have been planning it for several years, without doing that modelling and that long-term planning of how a community is going to deal with that. And I guess it will take 1 to 2 years for this to really start to play out. We'll start to see the impacts happening. It's not like we're going to have 500 built tomorrow, but we will see impacts on all of our infrastructure over time, and we won't know what that is until it happens. But it would have been nice if we could see some modelling and maybe some promise of infrastructure funding for some of those infrastructure needs.
Yeah, definitely hearing what you're saying there. I'm going to go now to a question that relates to Balmoral Beach. So somebody's really concerned about how the the policy is going to implement on Balmoral Beach. And they're saying, it's a really prized area, part of Sydney, part of the LGA, and it's not the Gold Coast. Is the proposed Balmoral area even within the 800 metres of Spit Junction? So that might be one.
Yeah. Look,
Dominic, if you'd like to take that.
Happy to take that, Deborah. So those who have eagle eyes may have noted that part of the indicative mapping produced by the Department of Planning, but not to be relied on, shows some R3 land that is down near Balmoral Beach, that is within 800 metres just. And so that is possibly going to benefit from the uplift and replace what's there right now. What's there right now is some very old 3 and 4 story residential flat buildings, which I think are an accepted part of the landscape since they've been there for such a long time. I guess the issue we have as a council is, and in accordance with that question, is we think Balmoral is pretty spectacular as it is, and certainly something we think needs protection as much as anything. Unfortunately, if the mid-rise changes apply to that area, and in addition, a developer was to seek a 30% additional benefit under the affordable clauses, the affordable housing provision clauses, we could have development that's 2 or 3 stories greater than it is right now. And where it is located down by the water's edge would mean it would block a lot of views. It would cause a lot of amenity impacts for neighbours, and kind of change, I guess, a lot of the streetscape and just the general perception of the area. We've been very mindful over the years to protect the way Mosman looks from the water, and there's controls that require us to do that. It's hard to understand how those could be applied if you suddenly get a 5, 6, 7 story building where there was formerly only a 2 or 3 story building. So yeah, it is a concern for us. It's a very front of mind.
Thanks, Dominic. Another question here, I think this is a really interesting one. What protections are council putting in place for homeowners to make sure that they're not going to be bullied or forced out of their home by developers? Dominic, that might be one.
Yeah,
or
yeah,
any?
I'm happy to take that. Look, at the end of the day, I think property owners need to be very aware of they've got rights like anyone else. So they've got both the rights to talk to a developer or a neighbour about development, but they've also got the right to say no. There are requirements for developers when they act to act in good faith, and obviously to follow contractual law. I would hate to think that any resident in Mosman would be bullied out of their home. But on the flip side, I know there were some changes to law for strata bodies to enable development or redevelopment of residential apartment buildings where maybe not every resident wanted it to occur. So that was to stop one holdout stopping a residential flat building being redeveloped. And I think the percentage now that must agree is 75% in a residential flat building must agree before it can be sold and potentially redeveloped. I think there'll be a lot of approaches to individual landowners which are not part of a residential flat building, but maybe people who own a detached home to sell up, and maybe options given to them. And all we can suggest is make sure you talk to a lawyer, make sure you get good advice, make sure you have a good read of any contracts that come your way. And also think about if you do sell up and you do go into a deal, that's fine, but where are you going to live next? Because this new change hasn't just impacted on Mosman, it's impacted not just on Sydney, but something similar is happening in most major cities at the moment in Australia as part of the housing accords. So we do expect there to be pressure. We hope that people are not unduly pressured to make a mistake and do something they regret.
Thanks, Dominic. And thank you to everybody for the questions that are coming through in the Q&A. I'm going to try and get through as many as I can, and your patience. Also, too, there's a couple of people that have popped in several questions. I'm going to try and spread the love around a bit and try and get to a variety of people's different questions that are coming through as well. Sarah, this one might be one for you. I guess it's a question here around the interplay between state government, local government, and who kind of wins out in the end, I guess, really. Are you planning to rezone any areas to allow council to decide where some of the density occurs in a controlled manner, i.e. around the Military Road, Spit Road corridors?
At this stage, we don't know how the low and mid-rise reforms are going to fall in Mosman. We don't know what the uptake's going to be, so we certainly wouldn't be rushing into any rezoning of any properties by any means. We have been approached by a number of parties about such a thing, but we really need to have a look at, what's Mosman going to look like 6, 12 months, 18 months down the track before we even start thinking about anything like that. And to be honest, it's unlikely that we would be doing that.
Terrific. Thanks, Sarah. Another question here. So the new policy states height, FSR and topology of new dwellings for specific lots. What other policies define items such as setback requirements, landscaping, percentages, etc.? The existing LEP and the DCP, or are there sort of no restrictions in terms of the new policy?
So it varies for each one. So for landscaping, there's the new tree canopy guide that needs to be considered for LMR developments. Council's landscaped area provision will still apply in the LEP, so that will still need to be considered. In terms of setbacks, it will depend on the form of development proposed. So if you have a residential flat building, the apartment design guide will provide the building separation or setback requirements. For all other forms of development, that would be within the development control plan, so the existing setbacks there. In both circumstances, the setback required is dependent on the height of the building. So you often have a stepped setback. So the higher the building, the larger the setback needs to be.
Terrific, thank you. Sarah, I think this is probably another question for you too. I guess it's around definition. So you've spoken about affordable housing. How is that actually defined? What's the criteria for a dwelling to be classified as affordable?
So the applicant would propose a dwelling as like they might have 20 apartments within their development. They may propose a proportion of those to be affordable housing. And the rules around that are set out within the infill affordable housing component of the Housing State Environmental Planning Policy. And I understand it relates to the proportion of the income of the person who's going to be renting those apartments. Is it 30%, Dominic? I think it's 30%. Yeah. So the rental can't be any more than 30% of their income.
Thank you. Thanks for clarifying that as well. There's a question in here that talks about infrastructure. And Dominic, I know you spoke about this before, and you two did as well, Madam Mayor, about this policy has been put into place and is being acted on. What sort of is happening in terms of the conversation with the New South Wales government around supporting infrastructure to support the density that will come and the increased population that will come as a result of these changes?
Look, it's a good question, and it's been a perennial one. It was not so long ago that the previous government was trying to take away all of the developer contributions we get as a result of each new development. And just so I guess people who are watching understand, every development application that comes in that's worth more than $500,000, a very small component of the value of that is given to council as developer contributions to help build things. And some of the things that people in Mosman might know and have enjoyed have been paid for by developer contributions, and they include the Allan Border Oval Pavilion, the Aquatic Centre, down at the Marie Bashir Sporting Centre, the works we did down at Balmoral Beach, the recent revamp of Mosman Square. All of those have had contributions from developer contributions. But in simple terms, it's not enough. And I think many people would understand that when you get a lot of development, as we're anticipating, there's a lot of infrastructure, and that can be just simple things like utilities, making sure there's enough substations, there's enough energy. All the sewerage and stormwater pipe diameters have to be increased, all the way through to the roads, the parks, the playgrounds, the number of doctors, the hospital beds, the school places, the university places, the number of buses running on the bus line. So it's granular, it's profound, and it's iterative. We, as council, have been very careful and prudent with our finances. We haven't gone for a significant rate rise. But I think what people will see is with a much bigger cohort of people coming in and a lot more density and development, that gradually some of the things we've got will get to a point where they're so loved and so utilised, we'll have to put further restrictions on them. It may be that not every child that wants to play sport can have access to an oval. It may mean that people have to travel in order to secure health services. There's all sorts of things that will have implications down the track. And I guess that's why we're so concerned that this planning is happening in this sort of haphazard fashion, instead of being carefully considered and have matching infrastructure and models so we know exactly what we're going to get and when we're going to get it. And that's not the case with this.
And can I add to that? The Australian Local Government Association today announced that a statistic that they estimate we need $5.7 billion from the federal government to meet the needs of infrastructure that will be required as a result of this uplift in housing. And the Australian Local Government Association have negotiated with the coalition, who've said they will agree to $1 billion a year for 5 years, and they're lobbying the Labor government to agree to do the same thing if elected. So hopefully, no matter who gets in, we will get that commitment, which will be very important. Another statistic they said was 30 years ago, we had double the amount of grants from the federal government as local councils as we have today. So a lot more of these costs are on local government now. So thus the push to lobby the federal government on our behalf to try and get these grants for infrastructure.
Thanks very much for that detail. That's really important for people to be aware of, I think, too, at this time. Dominic, I think this might be a question for you. So you talked before about sort of the 500 new dwellings as the target that needs to be achieved. What happens if that target is achieved? What happens if will further development still be allowed to occur over and above the 500 once the target is met?
Yeah, look, absolutely. In fact, in some respects, we won't be able to regulate how much will be delivered. We don't have that power to simply refuse DAs because the target's been achieved. The Minister for Planning's always been very clear that he doesn't see it as a maximum, or he sees it as a minimum, and they would love all of the targets for all of the LGAs across Sydney to be exceeded. So I anticipate we will easily meet that target of 500 and perhaps a great deal more. But as the Mayor said, there's going to be a bit of a hiatus at the beginning. There's only so many cranes and builders in Sydney and in Australia. And I think there's going to be a bit of a skills shortage. I think there'll be probably an equipment shortage, and there'll be a material shortage. There's a whole lot of vagaries going on in the international sense as well. So it might be that it takes a little while to build up a head of steam. But you do the maths, you only need sort of 30 or 40 large developments of the scale now allowable under these changes to hit that target of 500.
And I'll add to that too, is that the cost of those services and trades will also go up because of the increased demand, and how that will impact on developers that are wanting to develop, but seeing like we saw the cost of all of those things go up just in the last 3 years. We could well see that increase come again, and that will definitely impact on developers and their want to do the developments in terms of being able to make it financially viable.
Absolutely. There's a couple of questions that are coming through that are around sort of specific property questions that people have. And just a reminder that you are able to book a time with one of the planning officers at council to talk through your specific circumstances, and we will put those details up at the end of the session as well. So I won't ask those questions in this forum, and encourage you to reach out to council directly to book one of those sessions in. There's a couple of questions too which relate to the accuracy of the mapping that's been used by the New South Wales government to develop these zones, and yeah, how the process was actually run. Sarah, do you want to talk to that at all, or is that a dominant
Yeah,
question?
sure,
Yeah,
sure, that's
thanks.
fine. So the department has put out the indicative LMR map, and that is what it's named. It's indicative. It's just a guide. It shouldn't be relied upon by any means to determine whether a site is in or out of the housing area. For each site you are looking at, you will need to measure it yourself or engage a professional to assist you to do that. There's various ways you can do that. A lot of the online mapping tools have walking distances, all that sort of thing. But what you're going to have to pay close attention to is the definition of walking distance and how that applies to that site. So keeping in mind that safely walked is the important part of that definition. So you'd be looking to use footpaths and traffic lights to cross busy roads and that sort of thing. It's not a matter of just drawing a straight line to measure that distance by any means.
And so somebody's asked, oh, sorry, Dominic, you go.
I just wanted to add to it, a question that often comes up in this space is that some of that indicative mapping shows lots of land which are only half shaded, or where a piece of land might only touch the 800 metre distance but not be fully enclosed within 800 metres distance from the town centre. We've got conflicting advice. Advice from the Department of Planning suggests that if part of a lot is in, the entire lot is in and all benefits from the uplift and the increased density and height. But we've also got very senior legal advice that suggests quite the opposite, and that only that section of the land that is within the 800 metres gets the benefit and the rest of the site does not. So there may be some people wishing to add lots together and consolidate them, and that might include some lots that are outside of the 400 or 800 metre zones. I think we'd be looking at that very carefully because we do have that conflicting advice. And I expect there's going to be, a lot of legal cases and precedences set. And over the next, 6 to 12 months, the Land and Environment Court will be very busy indeed as people try and, understand these very blunt, clumsily drafted instruments, which, we're struggling ourselves to comprehend. And the department is fairly slow in putting explanatory notes and information to help us understand them.
Yeah, really feeling their way through. Bit of a different question here. Are there environmental measures mandated for in terms of the future buildings that will be developed? Sarah, that might be one for you.
So development applications lodged under the LMR would be no different from a normal development application. So there's a state environmental planning policy that requires applicants to prepare and submit a basics certificate. And the basics certificate outlines the sustainability measures that the development must comply with. That goes to things like thermal, energy, water efficiency, and the like. Yeah, so that will continue to apply to LMR developments.
Terrific, thank you. I'm going to go to some other sort of specific questions. Will there still be a requirement that any unit developed under these changes needs to have vehicular access other than directly onto a main road?
So I'll take that one.
Sarah? Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. One of the state environmental planning policies requires that where a site has frontage to a main road, that you should provide vehicular access from a road other than that main road. So where it is possible, it would need to be provided from a rear lane or side road or something like that. And that's obviously to not obstruct traffic on the main roads, Sved Military Road and the like.
There are some exceptions to that rule, though, particularly for larger sites. They sometimes do get permission, but that's from the state government rather than from council itself.
Another question here. What if your street is zoned as R2 in the LMR zone, but your near neighbours are R3? Thereby, a high-rise could be developed metres away from that particular property. Will council review street zoning if they are off Military Road and close to Spit Junction?
Look, I think Sarah's answered that already in part. So, I'm sure the audience has got some people who don't like these controls, and it's got some people who do like these controls, and some people who are just missing out because of their zoning or because of their location. from the uplift which these controls allow for. Rezoning property is quite an undertaking. It's like making a mini local environment plan. I don't believe the councillors at this time have a strong appetite to do additional rezoning, given we've just gone through this big process and have these new controls in place. It'd be a very difficult argument to sustain that we've suddenly got a lot more density we weren't expecting in locations we also weren't expecting, and that's going to really stretch our infrastructure, and at the same time try and get even more infill, even more density through additional rezonings, just because an individual party might feel upset that they're missing out when their neighbour is benefiting. So at this stage, we're going to stick with what the planning minister has determined, work our way through that, and then come up for air, I imagine, in a year or two, when we've felt and seen with greater clarity and understanding the impact of all of this new density and all the development applications we're expecting. And after that, we might look at individual sites or perhaps areas where, you know, it would make sense perhaps for them to embrace those changes. But look, that's, as I say, a matter of months away, if not years.
Then there's a question here, which I guess is going to really, is there a concern, and this might be a question for you, Madam Mayor, around sort of, I guess, two parts of Mosman emerging, so that sort of lack of continuity in the community emerging because you've got these sort of different housing types coming through?
That's definitely a concern that has been raised, and it's particularly going to be in areas where there's a junction between the 800 metre zone and you're outside the 800 metre zone, potentially that area down at Balmoral, or an R3 area where you've got a single dwelling and you get a 6-storey house next to you. How that's going to play out, we won't know, as I said before, for quite a while. What I think helps me to sleep at night is the fact that property is expensive in Mosman, and people who want to buy in Mosman want to buy something that is nice. So I would imagine that the new properties that are built will be built nicely and attractively. Hopefully we'll have a nice streetscape that will blend hopefully with the rest of the landscape and the streetscape of Mosman. So we won't know the impact for a while, but it definitely will have an impact on the landscape of not just Mosman, but all of Sydney. And it's disappointing when, after we've had decades of having our own controls, planning controls that have been part of the community consultation to agree with those controls and how they want their suburb to look, and that is being taken out of our control. And I think that's the part that's disappointing for not just us as council, but for the community.
Sarah, I know you spoke about this earlier on, but there are a couple of questions that have come through that relate to heritage buildings and the treatment of heritage buildings and the protection of those. Do you want to just reiterate again a few points around that? I think that might be useful for the audience to hear.
So each application, so I guess starting with the reforms do not apply to heritage items. They do apply in heritage conservation areas. So potentially you're going to be getting these new built forms within the heritage conservation areas. Each development application that is submitted would need to be accompanied by a heritage impact statement. So that's a heritage officer that's reviewed and provides some argument as to how the development sits within the qualities or the significance of the heritage conservation area. And that's something that would be looked at very closely in the assessment of the development application. We have a provision in our LEP 510, which requires us to consider the impact on heritage significance. And each application would be considered on a case-by-case basis, and we'll be looking to make sure that the design of the new development is sympathetic to the heritage significance of either the conservation area or a nearby heritage item.
Terrific. And then again, another question which I think goes again to sort of reiteration of some of the earlier points that you spoke to in terms of the policy. But why is it that the policy focuses around Spit Junction rather than those properties that are closer to, say, Mosman Village?
So it all comes down to what the state government picked in terms of what town centres were included and were not included. At one point, we had some concerns that Mosman Junction might have been included as part of a town centre, whether that be Spit Junction or its own town centre, but that wasn't the case. So what defines it is the town centres map, which is a statutory map under the state environmental planning policy, and we're guided by that. Yeah, basically what they picked was town centres that have good services and facilities and are reasonably well supplied by public transport.
Mm-hmm.
In our case, it's buses. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, terrific. Thanks for reiterating that. I think that's important for people to hear as well. Somebody's asking a question about what mechanisms are going to be in place to ensure that the new buildings that are built under the policy are aesthetically pleasing and consistent with Mosman Council's brand.
That's a really good question, and I think the Mayor spoke a little bit to that. You know, a lot of people love Mosman. They love the way it looks. We get a lot of feedback from the community. They're very happy with the village feel. There's certainly a tip of the hat to a lot of heritage, and then there's some beautiful new buildings. One of the things that for the larger buildings will continue is that we'll require a development application, and that will be reviewed by our assessing officers. And one of the things that we look at is the articulation of the building, how it presents, the quality of the architecture. So we're hoping to get still good quality buildings, and it's, as the Mayor suggests, one of the functions of more valuable land is you tend to get better quality buildings. People are willing to pay and want that. The lower scale end of the low rise or the low and mid rise changes is a little different. And one of the concerns we have there is the proposal, as Sarah spoke to in her slide set, that some of this will be complying development. And so for those of you who aren't planners or familiar with the term, complying development means you can build a building without lodging a development application to council. Council has no role in assessing and determining the development as long as certain requirements are met. Essentially, the person who does determine the building can be built and signs paperwork to that effect is proposed to be the architect or the draftsperson of the building, stating that it broadly complies with the pattern book that Sarah also spoke to. So in simple terms, the government's released a series of designs with some requirements within them. And if an architect or a designer builds your project and it broadly complies with that, they can sign it off and it never comes to council. And as a neighbour, the first you'd find out about it is some notification that works are about to commence in a week or two, and off they go without us having input. Why we don't favour that outcome, and we'll be speaking against that in our report to council next month, is we believe that with our experience and with a submissions process by which neighbours get to have their say, we get better outcomes. It might take a day or two more, but I think it's important. Buildings are around for a long time, and we think the community voice is important. And we want a consensus around the built outcomes that we're getting. And if you have private certifiers, private contractors, private architects making decisions on behalf of their client, I'm not sure you will get the best outcomes. And it may well be that there's a conflict of interest as well.
Mm. Terrific. Thanks, Dominic. There's a couple. Oh, please.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Can I just add one thing, which some people may not know, is that the commercial area, so down our main shopping strip and commercial strip through the village, is exempt. So we won't see high rise or any changes to the building size along that main commercial area, which will maintain that village atmosphere and that main high street of Mosman, which is terrific.
Terrific, thank you. I'm going to circle back to the conversation that we had around Balmoral Beach as well. And somebody suggested here, is there anything that you could do to apply for some sort of national trust or park protection at all?
Yeah, look, that's unlikely as an avenue. You basically, those entities and heritage listing itself normally picks a building which has such unique attributes or profound attributes that it can be heritage listed. Again, the process isn't quick, and I think the government would be very conscious that there's a few councils out there trying to preserve areas by suddenly trying to heritage list them. What I would like viewers to understand is that any heritage control that becomes a strong control that's contained within our LEP or has a state listing ultimately gets the sign off of the planning minister. It's not something we can do in isolation. The best we can do is an interim heritage order, which is not a very useful or long-term construct to preserve Balmoral Beach. So I'm hoping, and I think the councillors are hoping, and I'm sure many people in Balmoral are hoping that we're either able to persuade the minister to change the controls in that location, or that the developers don't swoop in and build something that's particularly large and bulky and changes the character. So it's going to be tricky because, as Sarah mentioned, there's non-refusal standards. So, assessing officers can't just refuse a building because they don't like it. They can only refuse it if that's supported by the controls, and the controls now allow for more height and more density. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, yeah. And then I think the remainder of the questions that are here are really going to the questions around sort of next steps and what is council as a body going to do in terms of putting the best case forward for Mosman Council. So I might hand over then now to you, Madam Mayor, because I know that you wanted to talk to some specific things around that, and also to sort of reflect on what we've heard in terms of the discussion and the questions tonight.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Deborah. James, have we got that slide? We had a council meeting in March, and we discussed this exact issue, and we resolved to do what you see on the screen, which is basically to advocate as best we possibly can with the State Minister and the Premier to particularly address the R3 zone down at Balmoral. As Dominic mentioned, we've had extensive legal advice and very senior legal advice that it's very difficult for us to legally do anything to change this. I think our best course of action is to try and advocate with the Planning Minister and with the Premier. So having said that, I have heard from the Planning Minister at a housing forum that I went to in the middle of last year, where this exact topic was being discussed. And it was very apparent that he really had no appetite for giving local government much power around these sorts of decisions. And he felt very strongly that these sorts of decisions were best made by the state government. So I say that with the best of intention to do as much as we possibly can, but with a clear understanding, it's going to be very difficult, and we will be very limited to what we can do. So just in summing up from this evening, I really appreciate you all tuning in. I know it's much more difficult to be online, but I appreciate you staying with us and listening to everything. I hope we've addressed many of the questions that you had, gave you a lot more information about what we know and what we still are waiting to hear more about in terms of definition. As I said, I think it will change the landscape of Mosman, and how that will change will play out over the next 12 months to 18 months to years, and we will see it happen slowly. And that will have the availability of materials and services, how it will impact on infrastructure, that will all sort of play out as we see development applications start to come through. I really appreciate all your questions. It's clear that you've been very involved in this discussion this evening. And there's definitely a balance of questions and probably a balance of people on the call tonight that are hoping that this might have a positive impact for you personally, or possibly you're concerned it will have an impact on you personally or for the suburb itself, for Mosman. But what we commit to you is to keeping you abreast of what we know. And as things change and evolve, we will update you as quickly as we can. And that's why, as I said, we've hosted these forums for you so you can hear from us. It's sometimes easier to just hear from us rather than try and navigate reading all the new controls. As we mentioned at the beginning, Joe Vattel is here at Council. There's a booking form if you scan this QR code. To make an appointment if you want to talk specifics about your particular property. But one thing that I'd like to mention is I went to a housing forum that was held by our federal member a few months ago, and a statistic that was disclosed at that forum was that, I'm not sure if anyone else knows this, I certainly didn't know it, we have the highest number of residences per person in Australia and in Sydney than we've ever had before. So I'll just let that sink in for a second. The highest number of residences per person that we've ever had before, and yet we have a housing crisis. And so then you question, well, why do we have a housing crisis? And what can be done at a state and federal level to be assisting with this? So these particular planning controls have been put onto us as local government, but there's a lot of things that should be and could be happening at a federal and state level. And Dominic mentioned some of those before. You know, foreign investment is a big one with land banking. Immigration, of course, that's, you know, we want immigration, but the pace at which we have immigration needs to keep up with housing that we can provide. Negative gearing and capital gains tax, I believe some of the federal candidates are trying to address that in their policy proposals. And things like Airbnb, where properties are being left empty when they could be available full-time for families to live in. So there's definitely federal and state levers that should be and could be pulled rather than pushing this all onto local government. I think that's something that's really important. I hope I say it early and often enough that it gets picked up by the media and by the federal members to actually think about that and address some of those issues. And the other thing I just wanted to say is that I have spoken to many of the other mayors around Sydney. They all share all of our opinions, and they all put in similar submissions last year to the planning ministry on these reforms and these controls, and they all share in the same concerns that we have, and their communities are feeling the same way we are. So I just wanted to reassure you, it's not just Mosman, it's the whole of Sydney, the whole of all of the capital cities really around the country. So I commit to you to do our very best to advocate on your behalf and to keep you informed as best we possibly can with any new information that we have. There's a QR code that hopefully when you scan it on your device that you're using to watch this evening, that will take you to a feedback form for tonight's session, and also a link to Joe, our planning advisor, and a link to the council website with more information. And that's where we will put a recording of this and a copy of the slides that we used this evening for your information. So I just want to say thank you so very much for tuning in and showing such interest in this particular topic, which will impact on us significantly. And please stay in touch, and we will too. Thank you very much. And I'll hand back to you, Deborah, I think, to close. Is that right?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And I just wanted to say thank you to the three speakers. There's been a couple of comments that have come through in the Q&A, just praising your professionalism and the accuracy and how you've addressed the questions. So thank you very much to you, Dominic and Sarah and Madam Mayor, for the great work that's gone into preparing for tonight and presenting as well. But thank you everybody for joining us. And yes, the recording will be made available shortly on the website. Thank you, everybody.
Lovely. Thank you, everyone. Good night.